Local file inclusion vulnerabilities. These exploits or vulnerabilities allow you to read any file that is within the same server. So even if the file exists outside the var www, you'll be able to read it and read info with it. Now, why this vulnerability is critical, because you can read any files. So if the users are storing some sort of important files or password files, then you'll be able to read them, and then from there you can further exploit your target. Also, if there is a number of websites on the same server and you manage to find this on a website that you're not targeting, then you might be able to access files related to the website that you're targeting and then further exploit your website from there. So let's have a look on this. And the way we're going to be exploiting this vulnerability is through the URL. So usually in our code execution example, we were writing the code in here. Now, sometimes you might find the code vulnerability in the URL. So it will be something like cmd, and then you put the command, or for example, in this case, it would be IP equals to the IP, for example, 10.20.14.203, and then you put the sign, and then you put your PWD after it, for example. So, because our example was just in the text box. Same is going to happen here in our file inclusion vulnerability. So we can see that when you're in here in this URL, it's saying that this file is going to take a page and it's loading something called include.php. So it looks like it's actually loading another page, like this current page is loading another page called include.php. So again, you'd be browsing the web server and trying to get a feel of it, and you see something like this, or you see something called IP equals the IP, and then you know that there's a ping, for example, for the previous video. So for this, that we know that our target is trying to open a file, and the file is called include.php. Let's see if there is actually a file called include.php. So I'm just going to remove everything here and try to access include.php directly. And as we can see, we actually do have a file called include.php. It's not running properly, but it exists and it's in the same working directory. So let's try and see if we can read a file that is stored in the computer. And we're going to use a file called etc password. So that's the file which contains all the users and their paths on the current web server. So let's have a look on this. So etc, this file contains all the users for the current operating system. So if I just go on my Kali right here, and if I run it here, if I just do cat etc password, you'll see all the users that I have on the current computer and their default path on the current operating system. So we're going to try to read this file. And to do that, let's go back and see our current location. So our current location is in the FI file, in the FI directory. So we need to go back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, and then go to etc password. So going back would be done using the ... And let's try and do that. So at the moment, we're accessing this current file. And just to make it easier for you, actually, let's just put the full path right here. So on the page, it's trying to access this page. So what we actually want a place called etc password. So we need to go back 5 times for these directories. So this one is going to be, let's start them from here. So we're going back, 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 and back, and then we're going to go to etc password. And as you can see, now we have the output of the etc password file. We can copy that and store it here, and then you'll be able to read it and just get more information about the websites that you're targeting right now. Again, you can use this to try to access different files, sensitive files, or files of other websites on the same server. Now let's go to the security settings, and I'm going to set this to medium because I just want to show you that the medium setting in this is actually can be exploited exactly the same way as the low level. So the security is set to medium. I'm going to go back to file inclusion, and we're going to use the exploit the exact same way that we did it before. And as you can see, we managed to get the contents of etc password. So local file inclusion is really good because it allows us to read files in the server, and we might be able to read files with passwords or sensitive information. What will be really great is if we can actually gain full access or full control over the target server using local file inclusion vulnerabilities. So in this lecture, we'll see how we can get a reverse shell by exploiting the local file inclusion vulnerability that we've seen in the previous lecture. So because they allow us to read files on the server, so if we manage to write anything on that server, then we can write some malicious code and then browse it and get that code to be executed. So this is exactly what we're going to try to do. There's a number of methods to achieve that. So usually it's done using the log files because the log files usually register or write stuff that happens on the server. So you can try to log in with a username, but instead of putting a username, you put a PHP code, or you can try to send an email, and then instead of the email, put a PHP code, and then try to browse these log files, and the PHP code will be executed. The first method that we're going to have a look on, though, it's going to exploit the environment variable. So this is basically a file that contains an array of information about the current environment. So let's just have an example of this quickly. So right here, I am on my Kali machine. I'm not hacking anything. I'm not on any server. And I'm just going to see what's the content of that file. So this file exists in all Linux operating systems. So I'm just going to open that file right now using the cat command. And as you can see, you'll see a number of environment variables that are related to the current environment. So what we're going to do now is we're going to try to open this file here in my browser instead of the etc password. So it's going to be in proc self environ. Okay, I'm going to hit enter. And as you can see, again, we can see an array of variables about the current environment. What's interesting here is this variable. So we can see that the user agent is being sent and it's being displayed right here. Now the user agent basically is the current browser used by the user. So you can see that because I'm using Firefox, the website thinks that I'm using Firefox, which is correct. And that's because Firefox, every time you open a website, it actually tells that website what browser it is. So this happens on all websites. So we can see that Firefox is telling the website or the web browser that I'm Firefox 5 and it's running on Linux, whatever. So this is actually sent from the client. So we can actually modify this value. And what we're going to try to do is we're going to modify the user agent value, and we're going to place code that will give us reverse shell. Before we do that, let's make sure that the code will be executed on the server. So we're going to send just a normal PHP code that will display PHP information. So I'm going to turn on my interceptor. Now, I showed you how to set up burp proxy. So if you don't know how to do that, go back to that lecture and see how you can set up burp proxy. So I just turned on the interceptor and I'm going to browse the exact same URL. And right here, if we go on the headers, you'll see that Firefox is sending the user agent right here, and it's sending it as Mozilla 5 and then Linux, whatever. So what we're going to do is we're going to modify this value and we're going to put PHP code. And the code I'm going to put is very simple. It'll basically just display the PHP information. So it's a function called PHP info. And then I'm going to forward this packet. And as you can see, the PHP code got executed on the website, on the target website. This means if we send malicious code to this website, we'll actually be able to gain full access, or we can get our code to be executed. Now you can literally send any PHP code you want. You can send code to list files, you can send code to upload a file, or you can send one of the codes that we used before to gain a reverse connection. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use the exact same code that we used before in the previous lectures to gain full control over the target computer. So I'm actually just going to type it down here in terminal, and then I'm going to copy it. So we're going to be using pass-through, and we're using netcat. And then I'm going to put my IP address. And I'm going to use the port, which is in this attack, I'm going to use 8888. And then we put the semicolon. So it's the same, it's just a PHP function. We use that in the code execution lecture. So I'm literally just going to copy this, and I'm going to inject it as the user agent. Now, before I do that, I'm going to listen on port 8888 for connections. So we're going to use the same code that we used before again with netcat. And now we're listening for connections. We have our interceptor on. I'm going to browse the website. I'm going to hit enter. And I'm going to modify the user agent. Again, don't forget to put the question marks here because I only put the code there. So we have the opening and the closing for PHP. And then we put our code, which is the pass-through code, NCE, bin SH, our IP, followed by the port that we're listening on. I'm going to hit enter. And I'm going to forward. And as you can see, we got a connection back using the local file inclusion vulnerability. Now I can browse files. I can do pwd, I can do ls, I can do id, and I can pretty much do anything I want on the server now that I have full shell access. So we were able to convert a local file inclusion vulnerability that can only show you files or can only allow you to read files on the server. We were able to convert that and exploit it to get full access to the target server. All is that possible because we were able to write to the proc self environ variable, which displays our user agent, and by changing the user agent to our PHP code, we were able to run any PHP code that we want. In this lecture, we're going to see another method of exploiting local file inclusion vulnerabilities and gain full shell or full control over the target server. So in the previous video, we've seen how to do it using the environ variable or environment variables. And in this lecture, we're going to see how to do it based on the logs. These servers have a lot of log files, and basically at the moment we can read any file on the server as long as we have permissions to read it. So if we can manage to write anything to any of these files, then we can pretty much execute code and gain control over our target. So what you need to do is you need to try and read any of the log files and see or think of a way to interact with these log files so that you can write stuff on it. For example, if the log files that you're reading or interacting with are mail log files, then maybe you can send an email with a code and then it'll show up in the log file. In our example, we're going to be using the var log auth.log, and this file contains all the login attempts to the target server. So let's do it and you'll have a better understanding. At the moment now, I just have the basic exploit and I'm trying to show etc password. So this is the file that we used in our basic exploit. I'm just going to remove that. And I'm going to look for var log auth.log. Now, as you can see, the file is readable and we can read login attempts to the target server. So what we're going to do, we're going to think, now this file displays all login attempts. So why not try to log in and see if the attempt will be displayed here. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to try to SSH into the server. So I'm going to use SSH. SSH is just a remote login service that is used by web servers. Pretty much every web server has it installed. So we're going to try to SSH into it. So we're going to do SSH, and then we're going to put the username, and I'm just going to put a random username that probably doesn't even exist. I just want to see if this request will be recorded in the log file. So I'm going to SSH, and I'm just going to put a username as random. And then I'm going to do add, and we're going to put the IP address, which is 10.20.14.210. And I'm going to hit enter. Now it's asking me for a password. Obviously, it doesn't exist anyway, so I'm just going to put a random password as well. And I'm not really trying to hack using SSH. I'm literally just attempting to log in. I'm going to Control-C now, and I want to see if this will be logged in this file. So I'm going to send another request, and I'm going to look for my username. So the username was called random, and I'll see if that was logged. And you can see here it's telling us in the log file, so it was recorded in the server that someone tried to log in with the username random, and it actually has my IP address. So it's actually recorded my IP address as well. So now we can read that file, and we can also write to the file by logging in with a non-existing account. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to try to log in again, and instead of putting a username, instead of putting the username as random, I'm actually going to put the PHP code that we always used to give me a reverse shell or reverse connection on this server. Now again, you can use any PHP code you want. In my example, I'm going to use code that will give me reverse shell on the target computer. So before I run the code, I'm going to listen on the port, and I'm going to do that using netcat like we always did. So it's going to be netcat vvlp, and I'm going to put my port, which is 8888. And now we're listening for connections. And I'm going to try to log in again to the target. And in this case, I'm actually going to put my PHP code. So same code that we used before. So my username is going to be, I'm going to put 2 quotes, and then I'm going to put my PHP code. So we're using pass-through. And then we're going to pass the command, the PHP command that we want to run. And that command is going to be, I'm going to use single quotes here. And then my command is going to be netcat e bin sh. Then I'm going to put my IP address, which is 10.20.14.208. Then I'm going to put the port that I'm listening on, which is 8888. Now, with this method, you're only going to get one shot with this code, because if you put the code incorrectly, the whole thing is going to break, and the file is not going to be displayed anymore because you have an error in your code. So what I suggest is, I'm going to keep the pass-through as it is, because that's a safe function, and I'm sure that this is going to run correctly. I forgot to put a semicolon here, so I'm going to put that there. So I'm sure that this code is going to run correctly, but I have a lot of minuses in here, I have a lot of spaces, and I have a lot of forward slashes, which always have problems when you're trying to pass them between Linux commands. You can try to skip through these characters, but what I suggest is you actually encrypt this using base64 and then decrypt it at the other end. So I'll show you how to do that. First off, I'm going to copy this command. So this is the shell command that we want the pass-through function to run. I've copied it. I'm going to go to my burp suite. And I'm going to go to my decoder here. We never had a look on the decoder. So this tab allows you to encode and decode text to different types of encoding. So I'm going to paste what I copied, and I'm going to encode it as base64. So this text, the netcat bin sh, my IP port, is converted to this encrypted code. I'm going to copy this code, and I'm going to substitute it here into my command. So instead of running it like this, instead of putting the text, I'm going to put the base64 code to make sure that there's no special characters that would interfere with the command with the bash. So I have that copied. Now, if I run this this way. So I have my pass-through, which is a PHP function, and I'm telling it to execute this shell command. Now, obviously, if you copy this text and run it, it's not going to run anything because it's just gibberish. So I need to tell it that this is base 64 code, and I'm going to do that using a PHP function called base 64 decode. So I'm going to tell it to decode this piece of text, and then once you decode it, run the pass-through on it. So I'm just going to type it in here. So it's going to be base 64 decode, and that's just another function, a PHP function. And then I'm going to put the brackets. So I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so we can talk about it more. And I'm just actually going to copy it and run it again, just so that we'll talk about it a little bit more. Okay, so first off, we're actually using the username as our code, as the code that we want to inject, because as we see, the username is being displayed on the log page. So anything we put in the username will be executed as PHP code. So we have that between two quotes here, between this and this quote. Now we have our PHP code that we always used, and we also always used the pass-through function to run Unix commands on the target server. So we're keeping that the exact same, and we're telling it to run this text, but before you run this text, I want you to decode it based on base 64. So we have pass-through, decode the following code, and this is the code. So this is the command, the netcat command that we always use. We're decoding it based on base 64, and then we're telling it to run it using the pass-through function to execute it as a bash command. So I'm going to hit enter now, and that will ask me for a password because it thinks that this is actually a username. So we're injecting the whole thing as a username. So I'm just going to put any password, anything random, hit enter. Now this should be stored now in the logs. So this code should have been injected into the auth.log. So we're going to go back now to our browser, and you can see that I'm already listening here. So I'm just going to hit enter here on the browser. And as you can see, we got a connection back from our target website. And if we do ID, you'll see that I'm into the target website with www.data username or user group, and I can run commands or do whatever I want on the target server. This is just another method of exploiting local file inclusion vulnerabilities to get a shell on the target computer. Now again, this is just an idea, and you can try these ideas with different types of log files. So you can try it with the auth.log, you can try it with any other type of log files, but you need to think about it. You need to think how you could inject code into that log file. So for example, as I said, if it's a mail server, then try to send it an email. If it's the auth.log, like we have in this current example, then try to log in using SSH and see if you can inject code and if that code will be executed on the target computer.